Hello, my dear lovely students. I miss you guys a lot. I think about you guys often. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're healthy. Hopefully you're staying active, and I don't know when we'll get to see each other again, but until then, YouTube is gonna have to do. So what I would like to do is I would like to read you guys a book. I picked out the book called The Books of Elsewhere. Here's the front cover. It is written by Jacqueline West. This is volume 1, so apparently there's other books. My son, William, has been reading this book. He's told me a little bit about it. I haven't actually read it, but the things he's told me about it makes it sound very interesting, and I think you guys will enjoy it. It has some pictures in it, and I'll make sure I share those with you when I get to them. So you can see them, but I'd like to read this book to you. So the chapters are fairly short, so I might do a couple chapters at a time, and then just post multiple videos. So you can check in the next day and see if I've got another one posted, and we'll go from there. I also will be posting other videos, hopefully, of just kind of some random entertainment. My kids have been up to some crazy things, so maybe I'll get some good videos of them so that you guys can see my kids in action, see what's going on at our house. So let's see, The Books of Elsewhere. And chapter 1 right away starts off with a picture. Looks like kind of a creepy house. Okay. All right. Miss McMartin was definitely dead. It had taken some time for the neighbors to grow suspicious, since no one ever went in or came out of the old stone house on Linden Street anyway. However, there were several notable clues that things in the McMartin house were not as they should have been. The rusty mailbox began to bulge with odd and exotic mail order catalogs, which eventually overflowed the gaping aluminum door and spilled out into the street. The gigantic jungle fern that hung from the porch ceiling keeled over for lack of water. Miss McMartin's 3 cats, somewhere inside the house, began the most terrible yowling ever heard on quiet old Linden Street. After a few days of listening to that, the neighbors had had enough. The authorities arrived in a big white van. They marched in a group up the porch steps, knocked on the door, waited for a moment, and then picked the lock with a handy official lock-picking tool. A few minutes went by. All the neighbors held their breath, watching through the gate gaps of their curtains. Soon the uniformed group reappeared, rolling a white sheeted stretcher onto the porch. They locked the ancient front door behind them and drove away, stretcher and all. Rumors soon began to fly regarding where and how Miss McMartin had finally kicked it. Mrs. Nivens, who had lived next door for as long as anyone could remember, told Mrs. Dewey that it had happened in the hallway, where someone or something had startled Miss McMartin so badly that she fell down the stairs. Mr. Fergus told Mr. Butler that Miss McMillan had collapsed on the living room rug in front of the fireplace, while a sheaf of secret family papers went up in smoke behind the grate. Mr. Manahan decreed that she had died of old age, plain and simple. He had heard that she was 150 years old, after all. And there were various theories as to how much Miss McMartin's face had been eaten by her cats. Miss McMartin had no close family. Her nearest relative was a distant cousin who had recently died in Shanghai after a severe allergic reaction to a bowl of turtle and arsenic soup. Yeek. There was no one to come and collect an inheritance, or to dig through the rickety attic for long-lost treasures. The old stone house, covered with encroaching scarves of ivory, was left full of its antique furniture and strange knickknacks. Miss McMartin's yowling cats were the only items to be removed from the house. Wrestled into kitty carriers by 3 scratched and bleeding animal shelter workers. And then, according to Mrs. Nivens, who saw it all through her kitchen window, just as they were about to be loaded into the animal shelter truck, the 3 kitten carriers popped open simultaneously. That means all at the same time. A trio of gigantic cats shot across the lawn like furry cannonballs. The sweaty shelter manager wiped a smudge of blood off his cheek, shrugged, and said to the other 2, "Well, how about some lunch?" It wasn't long before someone heard about the old stone house for sale at an astonishing low price and decided to buy it. These someones were a Mr. Alec and Mrs. Alice Dunwoody, a pair of more than slightly dippy mathematicians. The Dunwoodies had a daughter named Olive, but she had nothing to do with the house buying decision. Olive was 11 and was generally not given much credit. Her persistently lackluster grades, that means not very good, in math had led her parents to believe that she was some kind of genetic aberration. They talked to her patiently, as if she were a foreign exchange student from another country who no one had ever heard of. In late June, Mr. Hambert, realtor, led the Dunwoodies through the McMartin house. It was a muddy afternoon, but the old stone house was dark and cool inside. Trailing along behind the rest of the group, Olive could feel the little hairs on her bare arms standing up. Mr. Hambert, on the other hand, was sweating like a mug of root beer in the sun. His cheeks were pushed up into red plump lumps by his wide smile. He could smell a sale, and it smelled as good as a fresh bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich. As they walked along the first floor hallway, he kept up a flow of chit-chat. "So how did you 2 meet?" Mr. Hambert asked Mr. and Mrs. Dunwoody, pulling the chain of a dusty hanging lamp. "We met in the library at Princeton," answered Mrs. Dunwoody, her eyes glowing with the memory. "We were both reading the same journal, The Absolutely Unrelenting Seriousness of Mathematics for the New Generation." Or awesome, get it? Interjected Mr. Dunwoody. "Awesome, very clever. And Alex asked me, have you seen the misprint on page 25? They had written the Theodorus constant." That's a weird word. "Is the square root of 2? Interjected Mr. Dunwoody again. "How their copy editors missed that, I can't imagine." "Oh, we both laughed and laughed," sighed Mrs. Dunwoody, with a misty look at her husband. "Well, you must be a regular math whiz with parents like yours, am I right?" said Mr. Hambert, leaning his sweaty face toward Olive. Mr. Dunwoody patted Olive's shoulder. "Math isn't really her thing. Olive is a very creative girl, aren't you, Olive?" Olive nodded and looked down at the toes of her sneakers. Mr. Hambert kept up his shiny-cheeked smile. "Well, good for you," he said, stopping in front of a pair of dark wood doors, carved into shiny raised squares. He pushed them open with a grand gesture. "The library," he announced. Through the doors was a large, dusty room, almost the size of a small ballroom. The wooden floor was a little scratched, and the tiles around the giant fireplace were chipped here and there. But these flaws made the vast room seem cozier. In fact, it looked as though it might have been used yesterday. Long shelves, still covered with rows of embossed leather volumes, stretched from the hardwood floor to the stenciled ceiling. Ladders on wheels, the kind that Olive had only seen in old paintings, were leaning against the shelves so that the very highest books could be reached. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of books, obviously collected by several generations of McMartins. The managers of the estate have decided to sell the contents along with the house. Of course, you can dispose of these however you choose, said Mr. Hambert, consolingly, as though many books would be a terrible bother. This room would be just perfect for studying, correcting papers, writing articles, don't you think? Said Mrs. Dunwoody to Mr. Dunwoody dreamily. Oh, yes, very cozy, agreed Mr. Dunwoody. You know, I don't believe that we need more time to make up our minds, do we, dear? Mr. and Mrs. Dunwoody exchanged another misty look, and then Mr. Dunwoody declared, We'll take it. Mr. Hambert's face turned as red as a new potato. He burbled and shone and shook Mr. Dunwoody's hand, then Mrs. Dunwoody's hand, and then Mr. Dunwoody's hand again. Excellent, excellent, he boomed. Congratulations, perfect house for the family. So big, so full of history. A quick look around the second floor and we can go back to my office and sign the papers. They all trooped up the mossy carpet of the staircase, Mr. Hambert in the lead, puffing happily, Mr. and Mrs. Dunwoody following hand in hand, smiling up at the high ceiling as though some lovely algebraic theorem unfolded there. Olive trailed behind, running her hand up the banister and collecting a pile of thick dust. At the top of the stairs, she rolled the dust into a little ball and blew it off her palm. It floated slowly down, past the banister, past the old wall sconces, into the dark hallway. Her parents had disappeared into one of the bedrooms. She could still hear Mr. Hambert shouting, Excellent, excellent, every now and again. Olive stood by herself on the landing and felt the big stone house loom around her. This is our house, she told herself, just to see how it felt. Our house. The words hovered in her mind like candle smoke. Before Olive could quite believe them, they faded away. Olive turned in a slow circle. The hall stretched away from her in two directions, dwindling into darkness at both ends. Dim light from one hanging lamp outlined the frames of the pictures on the wall. Behind Olive, at the top of the stairs, was a large painting in a thick gold frame. Olive liked to paint, but she mostly made squiggly designs or imaginary creatures from the books she read. She had never painted anything like this. Olive peered into the canvas. It was a painting of a forest at night. The twigs of leafless trees made the black web against the sky. A full moon pressed its face through the clouds, touching a path of white stones that led into the dark woods and disappeared. But it seemed to Olive that somewhere, maybe just at the end of that white path, maybe in that darkness where the moonlight couldn't reach, there was something else within that painting, something she could almost see. Olive? Mrs. Dunwoody's head popped through the doorway along the hall. Don't you want to see your bedroom? Olive walked slowly away from the painting, keeping her eye on it over her shoulder. She would figure it out later, she told herself. She would have plenty of time. All right, that was just chapter 1 of the Books of Elsewhere. I think I'm going to stop right there and let you guys mull over that a little bit, and maybe I'll come back tomorrow and post the second chapter. Sounds kind of interesting. Creepy old house. The lady that lived there passes away, and this little girl's family buys the house. Anyways, I think it's going to get exciting. So my son, like I said, my son William told me a couple little things, and I'm kind of anxious to get to those chapters. He's maybe about halfway through the book now, so I have to share it with him. But anyways, that's chapter 1 of the Books of Elsewhere, and I will be back hopefully tomorrow to post the second chapter. Bye, guys.